Ethan stood inside the busy airport terminal feeling like the ground beneath him was shaking, even though it was just his nerves. People rushed around him with suitcases, children ran past laughing, announcements echoed overhead, and every sound seemed to hit him twice as hard. He held a small, trembling puppy named Milo against his chest, trying to act calm even though he felt like crying himself. This flight was supposed to be a new beginning for him, a chance to move closer to his daughter and prove that he could rebuild their life after everything fell apart. But from the moment he stepped into the airport, nothing felt easy, and for a brief moment, he even considered turning around and abandoning the whole trip. But he couldn't. This flight was his only hope. Just a year earlier, Ethan had been an ordinary husband and father living a quiet life. He worked long hours as a mechanic, came home to dinner with his wife, Emily, and spent weekends playing board games with their 8-year-old daughter, Lily. They weren't rich, but they were happy. Then a single phone call changed everything. Emily had been driving home late from a night shift when a speeding driver ran a red light, hitting her car so hard it spun twice. She died before Ethan could reach the hospital. Losing her shattered him in a way he couldn't explain to anyone. His home felt too quiet, too empty, too big. Every corner reminded him of her, the way she laughed while cooking, the way she tucked Lily in at night, the way she always knew how to calm him when he panicked. Without her warmth, the house turned into a place filled with memories that hurt more than they comforted. At first, Ethan tried to stay strong for Lily, but grief didn't come in gentle waves, it came like a storm. He went days without eating, nights without sleeping, and weeks without energy. He lost focus at work. He forgot appointments, burned food, missed school meetings. Eventually, Lily's grandparents stepped in and took her to stay with them temporarily until Ethan got back on his feet. Except temporary stretched into months. Then those months became longer, and soon, there were talks about custody arrangements, about stability, about whether Ethan was emotionally ready to raise a child alone. Those discussions crushed him more than anything else. He didn't blame anyone, they were worried, but the idea of losing his daughter felt like losing Emily all over again. Milo, the flop-eared puppy licking Ethan's chin at that moment, entered their life shortly before Emily died. He had been a birthday present for Lily, a sweet little rescue dog with big eyes and a clumsy tail that knocked things over. Lily adored him. When her mother died, Milo became the only thing that made Lily smile, the one tiny piece of happiness that stayed by her side. So, when Ethan learned he had a chance to move closer to his daughter, he knew he had to bring Milo too. But he underestimated how overwhelming traveling alone with a dog and 2 bags of luggage would feel. Standing at the check-in counter had been embarrassing enough. The airline employee spoke quickly, listing documents and pet fees and rules, and Ethan felt his face warm as he scrambled to find everything. Milo whined in his carrier, causing people behind him to sigh and shuffle impatiently. Somehow, he got through security, but even that was a nightmare. They made him take Milo out of the carrier, and the frightened puppy tried to jump out of his arms when a security guard passed a wand over them. People stared. Some gave sympathetic smiles. Others rolled their eyes, annoyed at the delay. By the time he reached the boarding gate, Ethan felt drained, sweaty, and very aware of every single person around him. As he shifted Milo in his arms, nervous that the puppy would start barking, he took a deep breath and tried to calm himself, reminding himself why he was doing this. He had found a small apartment near Lily's grandparents' home, took on extra hours at work to afford the move, and even attended counseling to show the court he was serious about rebuilding his life. This flight wasn't just about moving, it was about proving to everyone, including himself, that he was still capable of being a good father. He couldn't fail now. Unbeknownst to Ethan, a woman named Claire sat across the waiting area, watching him with a quiet sense of recognition. She was a single mother too, traveling with her 6-year-old son, Noah. Her divorce had been messy and painful, and she understood better than most what a single parent looked like when they were barely holding things together. She saw the way Ethan clutched the carrier with shaky hands, the way he kept checking the puppy's breathing, and the way he nervously scanned the gate as if preparing for something to go wrong. She didn't know his story, but she sensed the sadness tucked behind his tired eyes. When their eyes met briefly, Claire gave him a small, gentle smile the kind strangers sometimes share without words. Ethan forced a smile back, but it didn't reach his eyes. He felt overwhelmed to even register the kindness. Moments later, the boarding announcement echoed through the gate area, and people started lining up. Ethan stood, tightening his grip on Milo's carrier. Milo whimpered softly, his tiny paws pressing against the mesh. Ethan whispered, "It's okay, buddy. Just one flight. We can do this," but inside, he wasn't sure if they could. He felt like a man walking onto that plane, not just with a dog, but with every fear, every mistake, every insecurity he had been trying to hide for months. As he stepped into the jet bridge, breathing in the cold, recycled air, Ethan still wondered if he should turn around. But it was too late. The door behind him closed. The flight, the one he had almost canceled a dozen times, was finally happening. And he had no idea that a single mom sitting just a few rows behind him would soon change everything. From the moment Ethan stepped onto the plane, a heavy wave of anxiety washed over him, stronger than anything he had felt back in the airport. The narrow aisle felt tighter than he expected, almost suffocating, and the judgment in strangers' eyes seemed sharper under the harsh cabin lights. He squeezed past passengers already settling into their seats, whispering apologies each time Milo's carrier brushed someone's legs. When he finally reached his assigned middle seat, a cramped space between a serious-looking businessman and an elderly woman knitting a knot formed in his stomach. The businessman raised an eyebrow the moment he noticed the carrier. Muttering something under his breath about inconveniences, Ethan forced a polite smile, trying to make himself as small as possible, but his hands trembled slightly as he slid Milo's carrier under the seat in front of him. The plane filled with the usual sounds of a flight preparing for takeoff, overhead bins slamming, seatbelts clicking, flight attendants reciting safety instructions. Milo, however, sensed every vibration and every shift in energy. At first, the puppy whined softly, pressing himself against the corner of the carrier. Ethan whispered, "It's okay, buddy. We're almost through," slipping his fingers through the small zipper opening to soothe him. But the moment the engines roared louder during taxiing, Milo's fear erupted. A sharp, panicked bark cut through the cabin. Then another, and another. Each bark bounced off the walls like an alarm bell. No one could ignore. Heads turned instantly. A baby somewhere behind them started crying in response to the noise. The businessman beside Ethan let out a long, dramatic sigh, leaning away as if the sound alone was contagious. Ethan felt the heat rush up his neck as he stammered apologies to the passengers around him, gently shaking the carrier to calm Milo. But the more anxious he became, the louder the puppy barked, as if absorbing Ethan's panic through the air. The flight attendant closest to them walked over briskly, her tight smile suggesting she was trying barely to remain patient. "Sir," she said quietly, but firmly, "your pet needs to remain calm and the carrier needs to stay fully closed. Please make sure he settles down." Ethan nodded frantically, promising he would handle it. But inside, he felt like a child being scolded in a classroom full of strangers. The plane lifted off the ground with a sudden jolt, and the moment the wheels left the runway, Milo's barking escalated into frantic, repeated cries. Passengers exchanged annoyed looks, some whispering to one another, others throwing angry glances toward Ethan as if he had brought chaos onto the flight on purpose. A woman across the aisle pressed her call button aggressively, while a man in front turned around and snapped, "Can you control that dog?" Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He tried everything, stroking Milo through the mesh, speaking softly, rocking the carrier gently, but none of it worked. The dog was terrified, breathing fast, scratching, barking even louder as the airplane climbed higher. Each bark felt like another punch to Ethan's chest. He already feared people saw him as a failure in life, and now complete strangers were staring at him like he was ruining their flight. The elderly woman beside him paused her knitting and touched his arm lightly, whispering, "He's just scared, dear," but her kindness was drowned out by the growing frustration around them. Another flight attendant approached, this time sterner. "Sir, if your dog continues to disrupt the cabin, we may need to escalate the situation. Other passengers are complaining." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight as if he couldn't breathe. He apologized again, the words trembling. "I'm trying, I swear I'm trying," he whispered, but a few people rolled their eyes. Tired of his desperation, one passenger pulled out their phone and began recording not the dog, but Ethan himself, capturing his anxious attempts to quiet Milo. Seeing that lens pointed at him shattered the last bit of courage he had left. His eyes stung, his fingers shaking so badly he almost dropped the carrier. He felt humiliated, exposed, and judged by an entire plane full of people who knew nothing about him, nothing about losing his wife, nothing about fighting to get closer to his daughter, nothing about how hard he had worked just to get to this flight. At that moment he feared someone might report him, that he would be kicked off the plane, that he would miss his custody hearing and lose everything that mattered. Milo barked louder, shrill, scared, helpless, and, with every bark Ethan felt his own helplessness grow. He pressed his forehead against the seat in front of him, whispering, "Please, Milo, please," as if begging the universe for mercy. But the universe, at that moment, remained silent, and the passengers continued to glare, and Ethan sat there, drowning in panic, unaware that a single mother just a few rows behind him was about to stand up and change everything. Claire sat several rows behind Ethan, her seat tilted slightly so she could see down the aisle. And as Milo's frantic barking filled the cabin, she felt her heart clench with a painful familiarity she wished she could forget. She wasn't annoyed like the others. She wasn't rolling her eyes or whispering complaints. Instead, she listened carefully, studying the rhythm and tone of the puppy's cries. She understood fear, real fear, not the kind people joked about when they said they were terrified of flying, but the kind that lived in the bones. The kind that tightened the chest and made the world feel unsafe even when nothing physical was wrong. Years ago, before becoming a mother, she had fostered rescue dogs with severe trauma, animals who had been abandoned, mistreated, or frightened by loud noises or sudden movements. She knew what panic sounded like when it came from a trapped creature. And as she listened to Milo's frantic barks, sharp, repetitive, rising in pitch, Claire instantly recognized those cries as the same desperate pleas she had once heard from a terrified spaniel she rescued during a storm. It wasn't just noise. It was fear. Raw, shaking fear. And the moment she realized that, she felt anger not at Ethan, but at the way people were turning on him, piling judgment on a man who already looked like he was drowning in his own life. Her motherly instincts kicked in, not only for the frightened puppy, but for the man who looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. As she watched Ethan's trembling hands trying to soothe Milo through the carrier, something in her chest twisted. She saw the panic in his eyes, the embarrassment reddening his face, the way he kept whispering apologies even though no one cared to understand that he was trying his best. She recognized that panic all too well because she had lived it. She remembered the night her son Noah had his first public meltdown after her divorce. He was only 4, overwhelmed and confused, and the moment they stepped into a grocery store, he fell apart, crying so loudly that people turned and stared as if Claire were a failure of a parent. She remembered her cheeks burning, tears threatening to escape, and the urge to disappear. Yet no one had stepped in to help her back then. No one had offered a kind smile or a gentle word. Instead, people whispered comments about single mothers who can't control their kids. Watching Ethan now, she felt that same old pain, except this time the pain wasn't hers. It was his. And she couldn't just sit there and watch the cabin slowly crush him with judgment. Noah tugged on her sleeve, his little voice curious and concerned as he asked, "Mom, why is the puppy screaming like that?" Claire smoothed his hair gently, her eyes never leaving the front rows. She knew the answer, but she also knew she couldn't fully explain to a 6-year-old how fear lived inside animals, just like it lived inside people. "He's scared," she whispered, "just scared." But inside her, something stronger was building, a sense of responsibility, a heavy, quiet pull that told her she couldn't ignore what she was witnessing. She glanced around the cabin and saw frustration building like a storm cloud. People shifted in their seats, groaned loudly, pressed call buttons repeatedly, and whispered as if Ethan were intentionally ruining their day. It angered her, not the ordinary type of anger, but the deep, protective anger that rises when someone vulnerable is being torn apart by public judgment. Because Claire knew, with every fiber of her being, that the harshest pain for single parents wasn't the work or the exhaustion, it was the constant, unspoken fear of being watched, judged, and mislabeled by strangers who saw a single moment and assumed they understood the entire story. As the barking continued, Claire's breath grew heavier. She felt her pulse beating in her wrists, a sign she recognized from every time she had stood up to do something she wasn't sure she had the courage to do. She looked again at Ethan, noticed how he bowed his head in shame, noticed the way he clutched the carrier as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. She saw how alone he looked, like a man trying to keep his life from falling apart in front of 100 witnesses. And in that moment, Claire didn't just see a stranger. She saw someone who had reached the limit of what he could handle. Someone who desperately needed help but would never ask for it. Someone who, despite everything falling apart, was still trying. That was what broke her. That was the moment she decided she couldn't stay in her seat any longer. She leaned back, took a deep breath, and felt a quiet voice inside her say, "If you don't help, who will?" And with that thought, she unbuckled her seatbelt, ready to do something that most people on that plane would never expect a stranger to do, something that would soon change the entire course of the flight and the lives of everyone involved. Claire felt the entire cabin pulsing with irritation as Milo's panicked barks continued, and for a few seconds she sat perfectly still, her hands pressed flat against her thighs while her heart beat rapidly in her chest, knowing that if she acted now, people would judge her too, but she also knew that doing nothing would haunt her. With one firm breath, she unbuckled her seatbelt, despite the glowing seatbelt sign overhead, ignoring the shocked looks from nearby passengers as she rose from her seat. She whispered to Noah to stay put and told him she would be right back, then stepped into the aisle with the subtle confidence of someone who already knew what she intended. Even if the world didn't, her footsteps echoed softly on the carpet as she walked toward Ethan's row, and conversations around her hushed as curious eyes followed her movement like she was breaking an unspoken rule. A flight attendant hurried toward her, her expression a mix of surprise and disapproval, but before the attendant could scold her, Claire lifted her palm gently and said in a calm, steady voice, "Please, I just want to help. He's struggling." She heard people behind her whispering, some annoyed, others curious, but Claire kept moving until she reached Ethan, who was hunched over the carrier, with his face flushed and his eyes glossy with humiliation. He looked up at her in confusion, his voice barely a whisper as he said, I'm sorry. I don't know what to do." Claire knelt slightly so she was level with him and spoke softly, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "You're not doing anything wrong. Your dog is scared, not misbehaving, and you're overwhelmed, not careless. Let me help you." The businessman beside Ethan rolled his eyes dramatically and muttered, "Finally, someone who can fix this mess," and Claire turned her head slowly, giving him a quiet but fierce look that made him shrink back into his seat. Then, in a move that shocked nearly everyone watching, she turned to the flight attendant and said, "Switch our seats. Give this man my seat and my son's seat. I'll sit here for the rest of the flight, and I'll take responsibility for the dog." The attendant blinked, clearly stunned. "Ma'am, are you sure? You paid extra for your seats." Claire nodded without hesitation. "Yes, move us. They need help more than we need legroom." The businessman's annoyance instantly melted into joy at the thought of getting a better seat, and he quickly stood to swap places, grabbing his bags without even bothering to thank Claire. Other passengers stared, surprised that someone would willingly give up comfort to help a stranger. But Claire didn't care about comfort. She cared about doing the right thing, the thing no one else was brave enough to do. Once seated beside Ethan, she gently reached for Milo's carrier, her movements slow and practiced, and unzipped the top just enough to slide her hand inside. She didn't pull the dog out that would break airline rules, but she offered Milo her fingers to smell, letting him decide if he felt safe. Milo trembled violently at first, but Claire whispered soothing phrases, her voice carrying that calming tone animals respond to instinctively. Slowly, Milo's barking softened into whines, then into small, shaky breaths. His paws pressed against her wrist, seeking comfort. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, crinkled chew toy she had brought for Noah's entertainment, offering it to Milo through the small opening. The puppy latched onto it immediately, releasing tiny, relieved sounds as he settled. The transformation was slow but noticeable. Silence, which had felt impossible a moment ago, spread around them like a warm blanket. Passengers who had been frustrated and angry now stared in awe, their expressions shifting from irritation to quiet admiration. Ethan watched with pure disbelief, his eyes filling as the noise faded. His voice trembled as he whispered, I can't believe you did that. You didn't have to." Claire shook her head gently, offering him a small smile. "Sometimes people in us need someone to stand with them before the world breaks them. Today, that someone is me." Ethan swallowed hard, overwhelmed by gratitude so deep he couldn't find the right words. Around them, a few passengers nodded in silent approval, while others looked away with a hint of shame, realizing they had been quick to judge a man who was simply trying to hold his life together. The flight attendants relaxed, the tension in the cabin easing now that Milo rested quietly with his tiny head nestled against Claire's hand. In that moment, at 30,000 feet above the ground, Claire had done something that, while simple in action, was powerful in its humanity. Something most people would never do. Something many would call unthinkable. She chose compassion over convenience, empathy over comfort, and in doing so, she changed the entire atmosphere of that plane, and unknowingly, the direction of Ethan's life. As the hours passed and the plane hummed steadily through the sky, the tense energy that had once wrapped itself around Ethan slowly melted away, replaced by a warm, unfamiliar calm that came from sitting beside someone who didn't judge him but instead understood him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Milo, now soothed by Claire's gentle hand resting halfway inside his carrier, lay quietly with his tiny head pressed against the mesh as if he trusted Claire more than anyone he had ever met. Noah, now seated on the other side of his mother after the seats, which leaned forward slightly, fascinated by the puppy's soft breaths. Ethan kept glancing between them at Claire's steady calm, at Noah's sweet curiosity, and at Milo's peaceful state, and each time his chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with the overwhelming sense that something extraordinary had happened in the middle of that crowded airplane. For the first time in months, he felt the tight fist of anxiety inside his heart. Eventually, when he trusted his voice not to crack, Ethan spoke quietly, telling Claire that he didn't know how to thank her for what she had done. He told her that most people didn't even look at him kindly anymore, that ever since losing his wife, he had felt like he was failing every day, failing as a father, failing at work, failing at life. He admitted how terrified he was that the court would see him as unstable, as incapable of being the parent his daughter deserved. His words came out broken at first, slow and hesitant, like someone learning to talk again after months of silence. Claire listened with the patience of someone who had walked through her own emotional storms, nodding softly, never interrupting, her eyes carrying a compassion that eased the pain he had been carrying alone. When he mentioned his wife's death and the guilt he felt for every moment he couldn't hold himself together afterward, Claire's heart twisted sharply. She saw behind his trembling voice a man who had kept pushing forward even while the world kept pushing him down. Then, gently and without pity, Claire shared her own story, not to overshadow his pain, but to show him he wasn't alone in it. She told him about the day her husband left without warning, the day she had to explain to a confused and heartbroken child why their father wasn't coming home anymore. She spoke about the financial struggles, the sleepless nights filled with fear about the future, the day she cried in the bathroom while Noah napped because she didn't want him to see her break. She described how people judged her to how they assumed she was a weak mother or a chaotic mess when they saw Noah panic or cry in public. She told him how she had learned to keep going, not because she felt strong, but because she had no choice. Her voice wasn't filled with bitterness. It was filled with honesty, the kind that connects to wounded people in a way calm days never could. As they talked, the walls Ethan had built around himself began to crumble. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe enough to admit the things that terrified him, how lost he felt without his wife, how scared he was that his daughter might think he abandoned her, how unworthy he sometimes felt of being loved or understood. Claire reached out and placed a light hand on his arm, a simple gesture that carried more comfort than 1,000 words. She told him that struggling did not mean failing, that grief did not make him weak, and that just because life had knocked him down didn't mean he didn't deserve to stand up again. She reminded him that Milo's barking wasn't evidence of his failure, it was evidence of how deeply he cared, that he was trying everything he could to keep the fragile pieces of his life together around them. The cabin that had once felt hostile now felt strangely warm. Nearby passengers who had witnessed the earlier chaos watched quietly, some with softened expressions as they overheard fragments of their conversation. People who had rolled their eyes at Ethan now saw a father who loved deeply, a man who carried more pain than most could imagine. A few even smiled when they saw Milo asleep, as if Claire's act of kindness had reminded them that compassion still existed in unexpected places. The flight continued peacefully, with Ethan and Claire exchanging stories, fears, memories, and small pieces of themselves they usually kept hidden from strangers. It didn't feel like to people meeting for the first time. It felt like to souls recognizing each other's broken pieces and finding comfort in the fact that they weren't alone in their struggles. By the time the plane began its descent, Ethan felt lighter, not because his problems had vanished, but because someone finally understood him without judgment. Milo slept soundly. Noah leaned against Claire's shoulder, and Ethan sat quietly, staring out the window at the clouds below, realizing that the act Claire had done, giving up her seat, taking responsibility for him, standing beside him, wasn't just a gesture. It was hope. It was healing. It was a reminder that even when life falls apart, there are people who step in, people who choose kindness, people who choose to listen. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed he might actually be capable of rebuilding his life. Not because he was perfect, but because even imperfect people deserved help, understanding, and a chance to start again. When the wheels of the plane finally touched down, gliding against the runway with a soft jolt, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and nervousness wash over him, as if the moment the plane landed was also the moment his life shifted into a new direction he never saw coming. The passengers around them began unbuckling seatbelts and stretching their stiff limbs, but instead of the earlier frustration and coldness, there was now a quiet, almost reflective atmosphere in the cabin. Milo lifted his head and sniffed curiously, but remained calm, still leaning toward Claire's hand as if he claimed her as the safest person he had ever known. Noah rubbed his sleepy eyes and gave the puppy a small wave. Ethan sat still for a moment, unable to move, absorbing the feeling of having made it through something that had felt impossible just a few hours earlier. When he finally stood, gathering his bag and gently lifting Milo's carrier, he looked at Claire with an expression so full of gratitude that it nearly broke her. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "You didn't just help Milo, you helped me remember I'm not alone." Claire shook her head, brushing a stray piece of hair behind her ear, her voice warm as she said, "You never were alone. You were just trying to survive, and sometimes surviving makes us think we're the only ones struggling. But we all break. We all fall. The strength is in getting back up." Ethan swallowed hard, the truth of her words settling deep inside him. As passengers filed down the aisle, the businessman who had earlier complained stood near the exit waiting for his turn to leave, shifting awkwardly as if battling his own guilt. When he saw Claire and Ethan, he cleared his throat and said in a tone that lacked its earlier arrogance, "Look, I owe you both an apology. I was impatient and rude. I saw what you did, and I want you to know it meant something. People don't do things like that anymore." He hesitated, then lifted his phone with a slightly embarrassed expression. "I recorded everything, at first because I was angry, but then because what I saw was worth sharing. It might help someone else think twice before judging too quickly." Ethan stiffened for a moment, afraid of being mocked online, afraid of his worst moments being thrown into the world. But Claire gently touched his arm and said, "If he shares it, let him tell the truth, not just about the dog barking, but about you being a good father doing everything he can." The businessman nodded earnestly and promised he would tell the full story. And he did. By the time Ethan collected his luggage and stepped into the terminal, the video had already been uploaded with a caption that read, "Single mom gives up her seat to help struggling dad calm his terrified puppy mid-flight." Millions would soon see it. As they walked toward baggage claim, Ethan and Claire exchanged stories about where they were headed next. Claire was moving to start a new job, trying to rebuild her life with Noah after a painful divorce. Ethan was moving to be closer to his daughter, hoping to regain custody and show the court and himself that he could still be a strong and stable father. They walked together slowly, almost reluctant to part ways, because something about the strange little family they had formed at 30,000 feet felt too meaningful to simply let go of. Milo whined softly whenever Claire stepped too far from his carrier, and Noah held Ethan's sleeve as if he had known him for months instead of hours. When they reached the point where their paths would separate, Ethan paused, his voice warm and timid as he asked, "Would it be okay if we stayed in touch? I could use a friend like you." "And Milo clearly thinks you're magic." Claire smiled, that deep, genuine smile that softens a person's entire face, and nodded. "Yes, I'd like that." Sometimes the people we meet in the hardest moments become the most important ones in our lives. Over the next few days, something remarkable happened. The video from the flight spread across social media like wildfire. People from around the world commented, praising Claire's compassion and defending Ethan against the harsh judgment he had feared so deeply. Messages poured in, stories from single parents, from people who had experienced panic on flights, from survivors of grief and loneliness, from animal lovers who understood fear in a trembling puppy. For Ethan, the video became more than a viral moment. It became evidence, real and undeniable, that he wasn't a failure, but a man who had simply needed understanding. When he went to his custody hearing shortly after, his voice carried a confidence he hadn't felt in months. He told the judge about his efforts to move, his commitment to counseling, and his willingness to build a stable home for Lily, and for the first time, he wasn't shaking inside. For Claire, the experience became a story she would share with Noah for years to come, an example of choosing kindness when others choose convenience. She would tell him, "Remember the man and the puppy on the plane. You help people, not because it's easy, but because it's right." And each time she said it, Noah would nod proudly, remembering the scared dog who trusted his mother more than the whole world. As for Ethan and Milo, they visited Claire and Noah often. What had started as an act of kindness in a crowded airplane grew into a genuine friendship, one filled with shared meals, shared struggles, shared healing, and a bond no one could have predicted. Sometimes, the most important people in our lives arrive in the middle of chaos, carrying nothing but compassion and courage. Claire's unthinkable act on that flight didn't just calm a dog, it changed the course of 3 lives. And as Ethan watched Milo curl up peacefully at his daughter's feet weeks later, he realized something powerful. Sometimes the universe places exactly the right stranger at exactly the right moment, to remind us that hope always exists, even in the sky at 30,000 feet.